Welcome back to our channel. It's time for WarGames. WarGames has always carried a different kind of electricity. The moment that the double cage lowers, the match stops being a spectacle and becomes a pressure cooker where every choice feels like a dare. Over the years, wrestlers have talked about WarGames with a strange mix of pride and dread, because it doesn't operate by the logic of regular matches. The space is cramped, the rules bend emotions in strange ways, and the atmosphere always feels one step away from spiraling into something unpredictable. Even if you've watched every version from JCP to WCW, NXT, and beyond, there are stories buried behind this match that rarely get told. The kind of details that reveal just how wild, unsafe, and downright experimental WarGames really was. So today we're stepping back into the steel to uncover the insane moments, brutal accidents, and forgotten truths that turned WarGames into a legend. Let's begin. A Mad Max movie literally created WarGames. If you've ever watched WarGames and felt like it belonged in some chaotic post-apocalyptic world, that's because it actually does. Dusty Rhodes didn't dream up this structure during a booking meeting or while watching old wrestling tapes. He got the spark from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Sitting in a theater, Dusty saw that massive enclosed brawl, that brutal steel dome where anything could happen, and something clicked. Wrestling, he thought, needed a battleground like that, a full-scale war zone that swallowed wrestlers whole. That single movie moment turned into one of the most influential match concepts ever created. Here's the funny part. Dusty's idea wasn't originally meant to be some annual tradition or a super protected gimmick match. He just wanted something big enough, wild enough, and violent enough. So he sketched a two-ring cage, slapped a roof on top, and pitched a fight that didn't feel like wrestling. It felt like survival. WarGames wouldn't exist without that strange moment of inspiration inside a movie theater, where a piece of 80s pop culture smashed into pro wrestling and changed it forever. The first WarGames wasn't even on pay-per-view. It's hard to imagine today, but when WarGames debuted in 1987, it didn't arrive with a big pay-per-view hype package or a blockbuster main event slot. No, the very first WarGames match rolled out during the Great American Bash Tour as a literal attraction match. Picture this: a brutal, brand new concept so dangerous and so ambitious that it absolutely could have headlined a PPV. And instead, fans in the Omni just walked in and saw history waiting for them like it was part of the nightly lineup. That first match featured the Road Warriors, Nikita Koloff, Dusty Rhodes, and Paul Ellering taking on the Four Horsemen. The cage was fresh, the rules were wild, and nobody in the building had a clue what they were about to witness because the match type didn't have a legacy yet. It hadn't become a cultural monster or a yearly tradition. It was just this strange new battleground that fans got dropped into without warning. And maybe that's part of why WarGames worked so well from the start. It arrived without overexposure. No months of promos beating it into the ground. Just raw chaos inserted into a summer tour. Only later would it evolve into a pay-per-view staple, a WCW identity piece, and eventually a WWE mainstage attraction. But its first moment? It was almost casual, which is insane considering what it would grow into. WarGames was designed to trap the Four Horsemen. People forget this now because WarGames has become such a massive wrestling tradition, but originally it wasn't made for the fans, and it wasn't created to be some flexible gimmick you could throw any feud into. WarGames was a weapon, a solution, a cage constructed specifically to neutralize one group: the Four Horsemen. Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, and Lex Luger with J.J. Dillon as their manager. They were untouchable. They interfered whenever they wanted, ganged up on babyfaces at will, and controlled every championship that mattered. So Dusty Rhodes decided to level the playing field by literally locking them in a structure designed to take away every tactical advantage they had. So it wasn't a multi-ring spectacle for spectacle's sake. It was a story-driven trap, something crafted out of desperation and frustration inside the narrative. When fans in the 80s watched the Horsemen step into WarGames for the first time, there was this electric sense that the villains were finally caught in a situation they couldn't manipulate their way out of. In a weird way, WarGames began as a revenge fantasy. Build a prison so airtight that the most dangerous faction in wrestling had nowhere to run. And that original motive still echoes every time the double cage drops. The original WarGames cage was built poorly. If you've only ever seen the modern, perfectly welded, TV-ready WarGames structure, the older versions might shock you. The first few cages weren't precision-built engineering. They were rough, rushed constructions that looked intimidating but were full of hazards nobody had planned for. The metal mesh had edges that stuck out, corners that weren't sealed properly, and sections where the wiring bowed inward like it was barely attached. Wrestlers still talk about brushing against the steel and feeling it snag on their skin like barbed wire. Road Warrior Animal mentioned that the fencing on the early cages wasn't sanded down at all. It wasn't designed for bumps, scrapes, or sudden collisions. It was just metal put up quickly, and the ring crew hoped for the best. Inside that kind of environment, the slightest movement could turn into a legitimate injury. A routine whip into the cage might leave someone bleeding from a cut that wasn't part of any plan. It wasn't the dramatic, stylized bleeding that wrestling often uses for effect. It was the sting of sharp steel tearing through skin because the structure wasn't built with safety in mind. When people call those early War Games matches brutal, this is part of what they're remembering. The violence wasn't always designed. Some of it came from the cage itself fighting back. J.J. Dillon got legit broken bones in the first War Games. The debut War Games match in 1987 is remembered for its spectacle and chaos, but there's one moment that still makes wrestlers wince decades later. During the finish, the Road Warriors set up J.J. Dillon for the Doomsday Device, a move they'd hit cleanly hundreds of times. But inside War Games, nothing behaved the way it usually did. The roof was too low, the space too tight, and the timing had to be perfect. When Animal launched Dillon off his shoulders, Dillon didn't have the room to rotate safely. He came crashing down at an angle that sent a shock through the entire cage. The landing was so bad that Dillon immediately knew something was wrong. He'd suffered a separated shoulder, a real injury that nearly cost him his career. There was no way to pause the match, no medical stoppage, no chance to regroup. The brutality kept rolling around him while he tried to figure out if he could even move his arm. That injury became one of the defining stories of the early War Games era. It showed how unforgiving the structure was and how quickly a routine spot could turn dangerous when the environment worked against you. Wait, early War Games didn't allow pinfalls? Modern fans might not believe this at first because today's War Games matches feel like a highlight reel playground with big spots and wild pin attempts. But the classic War Games? Pinfalls weren't even allowed, not one. The older versions were about something far more brutal, submission or surrender only, and only after all wrestlers had officially entered the cage. You didn't score a fall, you broke someone's will. The match was literally built around the idea of forcing the other team to quit, which gave every moment inside that structure a heavier, almost gladiatorial energy. The two-ring roofed design made the match feel claustrophobic on purpose. You couldn't escape, you couldn't climb out, and you couldn't steal a win with a quick roll-up. Every strike, every hold, every weapon shot meant more because nobody was counting to 3. You won by breaking bodies or breaking spirits. And because the finish didn't come until the match beyond officially began, War Games had this slow burn tension that built layer by layer as each entrant arrived. When the final man stepped in, the match transformed instantly into a fight for survival. That original rule set is what gave early War Games its iconic reputation. Brian Pillman was almost killed inside. War Games 91. War Games has always carried a reputation for being unforgiving, but the 1991 version nearly turned into a real tragedy. During the War Games Wrestle War 91 match, Brian Pillman, who was noticeably smaller than most of the giants inside the cage, took a powerbomb from Sid Vicious that went horribly wrong. Pillman didn't have enough room to rotate or protect himself because of the cage's low roof, and Sid lifted him straight up into a move that had nowhere to land safely. The result was one of the most frightening visuals in War Games history. Pillman's upper body snapped down like he'd been folded in half, his neck and shoulders taking the full impact against the mat. For a few seconds, he didn't move, and the entire arena went silent. Commentators stopped their usual call because they knew something was genuinely wrong. Even wrestlers in the cage broke character, crowding around Pillman while trying to figure out if he could continue. Somehow, he survived the spot, but the moment became a harsh reminder of just how dangerous early War Games matches could be. There was no space, no escape, no time to adjust. Pillman was fighting through shock. Many wrestlers consider that powerbomb one of the scariest botches ever captured in WCW history, and it remains one of the incidents that defined War Games as a match type where one mistake can turn into a near disaster. War Games 2000, the three-tier cage disaster. If there's one version of War Games that lives in infamy, it's the chaotic spectacle WCW delivered in 2000, a three-tier cage stacked like a steel wedding cake, complete with weapons, platforms, and rules that seemed to shift every few minutes. On paper, it sounded like a dramatic reinvention. In reality, it became one of the most bewildering matches WCW ever produced. The structure was so oversized that wrestlers struggled to navigate it, and the camera crew could barely keep up with the action. The match wasn't just complicated, it felt unstable. Rooms, traps, random weapons placements, layers of metal, everything was fighting for attention. Fans still talk about it today because of how surreal the presentation looked, a far cry from the tight, suffocating environment that made the original WarGames so effective. Instead of war, it looked like a construction project spiraling out of control. Yet the match holds a strange place in wrestling memory. Even when WCW missed the mark, they swung big. WarGames 2000 is a reminder of how far a promotion will go when it's desperate to reinvent itself, even if the result ends up becoming a cautionary tale instead of a classic. WWE had to buy the name back. When WWE finally decided to bring WarGames into the company's modern era, they expected it to be as simple as dusting off an old WCW concept they already owned. But once lawyers got involved, something unexpected surfaced. WWE didn't actually control the WarGames trademark. It was sitting with Major League Wrestling, a much smaller promotion that had smartly locked down the name years earlier while WWE wasn't using it. That created a strange situation in which the world's biggest wrestling company suddenly had to negotiate just to legally use a match that fans already associated with its WCW library. It's one of those rare behind-the-scenes business twists that reminds you how messy wrestling history can be. WWE had the legacy, the footage, the announcers talking about WarGames in documentaries, but not the literal rights to the name. By the time NXT WarGames was announced in 2017, the paperwork had finally been sorted out. The company could move forward, but the delay explains why the match disappeared for so long after WCW folded. One forgotten trademark quietly held the door shut until WWE paid to open it again. AEW's Blood and Guts is WarGames in disguise. When AEW introduced a massive double cage match called Blood and Guts, fans didn't need an explanation. One look at the structure and everyone understood the message. This was WarGames without the name. AEW kept the enclosed roof, the staggered entries, the tight, suffocating environment, all the hallmarks of the original Jim Crockett Promotions design. They weren't trying to hide it. They were recreating a feeling that older fans hadn't seen in decades. There's a poetic quality to that move. WarGames vanished from wrestling for years, resurfaced in WWE with a sleeker look, and then reappeared in AEW as a raw, throwback experience. Blood and Guts brought back the gritty atmosphere that made the early versions so intense, almost like someone rescuing a piece of wrestling history and placing it in front of a new audience. Even the way the match unfolds with heavy violence, the crowd growing louder with each entrant, teams clashing until exhaustion takes over, mirrors the classic format. AEW just gave it a name they could legally own. But anyone who's watched both knows exactly what's being honored. Why did WWE remove the roof from WarGames? When WarGames returned under the WWE banner, fans noticed something missing before the match even started: the roof. The original structure was a sealed box, tight and unforgiving. WWE made a deliberate choice to open the top, and it wasn't done for spectacle, it was done for practicality. Triple H explained that the classic roof limited movement too much for the kind of fast, modern pacing WWE matches rely on. High-impact sequences, dives, and camera work all needed more space than the old cage allowed. Opening the structure changed the match's personality. Instead of a low, claustrophobic prison, WWE's WarGames became a sprawling battlefield with room for creativity. You started seeing spots that would have been impossible in the old format, like springboards, aerial attacks, weapon setups, and elevated team moments that required vertical freedom. It gave the performers more breathing room, literally and creatively. Remember that RKO on J.D. McDonough? Some longtime fans missed the old suffocating energy, but the open-top design helped WarGames evolve into something that fit WWE's presentation style. Different era, different expectations, same chaotic heart. Marvelous verdict. WarGames has survived reinventions, rebrands, network changes, and an entirely different generation of fans. Yet, it still feels like a match that carries danger in its bones. Every time that cage appears, there's an unspoken promise that something unpredictable is coming. Wrestlers talk about it with a respect that borders on superstition, because the match has a way of exposing people, testing them, and occasionally leaving permanent marks. That lasting aura is what keeps WarGames interesting even decades after its debut. It's not nostalgia, it's the understanding that very few match types force wrestlers to abandon comfort and step into something this unforgiving. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the madness behind WarGames, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep exploring the strange, the violent, and the forgotten corners of wrestling history. And let us know in the comments which WarGames moment shocked you the most, and which one do you think deserves its own full video? I will see you in the next one.